Beautiful day off for me, and guess what's on the agenda? That's right, one of these Thermoking APU units. Yay! Gotta love these things. Alright, well, what's going on with this one is it keeps giving a engine trouble code every time you try to start it, and there is a 30 amp fuse over here in the side box that it keeps blowing. Let's get a key. Anyway, you keep resetting this bugger. And it keeps blowing this 30 amp fuse right here when you reset it. And normally what that means is that you have a bad fuel pump. Let's see. Yeah, there is kind of sort of a wiring diagram, but just like most things on these trucks and APU units, they act like all the information is top secret. So nobody wants to tell you nothing about them. Anyway, on this particular model, they will charge you several $100 to change the fuel pump. And if you look right down here, you see that little smooth plastic thing there, those are the fuel lines. And they come in down through there, and if you follow them over, you'll see that little jewel right there. Well, that's the fuel filter. And pull the air filter off of it. You see that fitting right here. You see those two black lines I showed you earlier, they go in, and there's one down there with a compression fitting on it. Well, that's your fuel pump. Comes out of the fuel filter, goes into the fuel pump, and that other line you see curving around and going back out is the return line for the fuel. And it's just underneath the breather. So if you unhook this hose clamp here and loosen this up, and then right up, yeah, see the bracket, there is a bolt right here, I'm touching it, that you've got to take out. And then you could take this unit here out of the way, and the fuel pump will be straight down. It's not too bad to change them out, actually. Let's get started. Alright, there you go, one fuel pump. Now this air filter housing you got to take off. It's got two bolts on it, one at the front and one at the back there. This one here is stripped out, so it only basically has one on this one. But you take those two out, and then right down here is the upper stud that holds that fuel pump. You take that back line off, which takes a 9/16 opening wrench. And once you take that compression nut off, right there, you got to tap that line a couple times gently to break the seal on that compression ring, and then it just pops right off. Now, once you get that off, if you pull this upper hose back out of the way, there's a gap right here. You take that bolt off, take that line off, and then you can fish the fuel pump up through this gap and up there at the top, and it'll make it a lot easier to take that second line off that compression fitting. Alright, there you go, one fuel pump. Now this air filter housing you got to take off. It's got two bolts on it, one at the front and one at the back here. This one here is stripped out, so it only basically has one on this one. But you take those two out, and then right down here is the upper stud that holds that fuel pump. You take that back line off, which takes a 9/16 open-end wrench. And once you take that compression nut off, right there, you got to tap that line a couple times gently to break the seal on that compression ring, and then it just pops right off. Now, once you get that off, if you pull this upper hose back out of the way, there's a gap right here. You take that bolt off, take that line off, and then you can fish the fuel pump up through this gap and up there at the top, and it'll make it a lot easier to take that second line off that compression fitting. There's that fuel pump. And off we go. Here's our replacement fuel pump. They run $179 or something like that at Thermoking, and if you want to go to Thermoking, there's your part number for that particular unit. And as you can see, this is a Thermoking unit. There's another part number. The problem I have with these daggum Thermoking units is they last about a year, and then they charge you $179 for this daggum fuel pump, and by the time it's all said and done, you're paying about $400 for them to diagnose the issue and to take that thing apart and put a new fuel pump in it. And I mean, you're lucky if you get away with $400. I mean, they just really like to gouge the heck out of you. Anyway, here is the replacement fuel pump. It's an Elderbrock. And there is your part number or model number for the Elderbrock. These right here run tax and everything about $70, which is less than half the price of that Thermoking unit. And you can pick these up at most auto parts stores. Make sure you get the one for diesel fuel. Now, what I'm running into, the compression fitting will thread right into that end. Flip it around, the other end has got a hose fitting on it. So I had to go to Ace Hardware to get a nipple that'll go from this to a plumbing thread, which I'm going to have to use a little piece of hose in the middle of it. I already got the hose, but I'm going to use a hose and a couple hose clamps to go over to that nipple, and then I'm going to use an adapter to go from that plumbing thread to a pipe thread, and then I could thread me a compression fitting into the end of that pipe thread, which I'll have the sizes for that for you here a little bit later. But anyway, it's going to extend this out about that far off the end of that fuel pump, which is no big deal. I mean, I got plenty of clearance, and I'm going to hook all the outtake line up before I install this pump, because I could snake it back through. The thing you got to watch for is the flow direction. And now see, last time we had Thermoking put one of these on there, we had to fight with them for the extra shop hours that they charged us, because the idiot put the fuel pump on backwards. and he couldn't figure out what was wrong, so they had another diagnosis thing and all that, a couple extra hours, because he put the fuel pump on backwards. Then they tried to charge us because he put the fuel pump on backwards, and they wanted to charge us for that extra labor for him to diagnose the fuel pump was running the wrong direction, and for him to take the time to take it back off and flip the hoses and flip the pump around. I mean, that's just ignorance. But they were going to charge us for their mistake. Anyway, watch your flow direction. Those lines that I showed you earlier that come off the tank, they go through the sidewall of the box, they go over to the filter, and from the filter it goes to the pump. So it goes from the tank to the filter, to the pump, out of the pump, and then up to your fuel water separator and your pressure regulator, because there is a return line, so there is a pressure regulator on this system. So I'm not too worried about the 4 to 7 psi and the 38 gallons per hour that this pump will put out, because the pressure regulator will run that back into the tank. Anyway, I'm going to have to cut this pigtail off of this one, and I'm going to solder it onto here, and it's just red to red, black to black, so that I can just snap plug this right back into the electrical system. And I'm going to go ahead and test out a $3.49 Harbor Freight soldering pen, so we'll see how this goes. Anyway, this thing here is supposed to go up to about 800 degrees, so that ought to be plenty of temperature to solder this back together, and then I'm going to seal it all up with some good heat shrink tubing, and I'll show you the results. We got our plug soldered onto the new fuel pump. Now this casing that's on the original, it's not split, so I had to split that with my knife, and I didn't split it all the way, and after I cut the wires I just kind of slid it up on there, and then I'm going to work this abrasion resistant wire sleeve back down on there. I can't remember what they're called right now, but anyway, she's just about ready to install at this point. Here is our completed adapter to hook up this fuel pump to the original line. This is a 5/16 by 5/16 hosed barbed hose, and it's got a different thread than pipe thread, and I couldn't get the right size pipe thread to go to the compression fitting. So I got a adapter that fit that, and then goes to a pipe thread compression fitting, and that was about $11 for those 3 pieces at Ace Hardware. So now I've got a 5/16 hose that I'm going to put on here and attach it there with a couple of hose clamps, just keep it short. And if I need to, I can shorten up the original fuel line on the outlet side with just moving the compression nut up and then putting another compression washer on there. And this shouldn't leak because I've Teflon taped these 2 threaded joints. Now another little trick is, if you do not have Teflon tape, you can cut a couple of little thin strips out of a Walmart bag and wrap that around the thread, and it works pretty good as Teflon tape. I don't know how well it'll work for fuel, but it works great for air, you know, Teflon tape and air and water. But I don't know if diesel fuel or gasoline will degrade that, but I don't imagine it would degrade it very far back because it won't get through all the threads. By golly, it took me $100 to fix it instead of $500 or $600, and I didn't have to take it to Thermoking to work on that thing. By golly, there you go. Now baby, what's your reaction? That APU that I was working on, it actually was the fuel pump that was the issue, and the Elderbrock fuel pump I put on there worked perfectly. But it had another issue that I could not diagnose because I didn't have the computer or the tech manuals to figure it out on that. And you know how they're real secretive about how some of these commercial vehicles and how the APU generators are wired and how they work on these trucks. So anytime I work on them, since I didn't go to school for any of that, it's kind of a learning experience for me too. But it turns out I had to put it in the shop anyway. Couldn't figure it out. And what it was the engine speed sensor is what was bad on it also. And when the engine speed sensor is bad, it'll also make the fuel pump work intermittently. Now, I guess apparently the speed sensor had been going out, and the fuel pump was bad. I went and bench tested the fuel pump, and it definitely was bad. But I did save myself quite a bit of money on the fuel pump and the fuel pump replacement. But yeah, it was that stupid speed sensor, which is nothing I could have done about that. But anyway, the APU is running perfectly again, and I did save some money on a fuel pump replacement, and I eliminated a lot of the issues that they would have checked first on it, so they knew they didn't have to check those, so they had to go in and start checking the circuit boards and all that to make sure the main board was good, and then they had to go through the entire wiring harness, and it still took them about 14 hours with 2 techs on it to diagnose it and get it, you know, figured out so that they could fix it. And I mean, these were 2, you know, techs that have been doing Thermoking for years, and they were Thermoking trained, but they only charged me for 4 hours labor, which is not bad at all considering they spent about 14 on it. And one guy, he actually stayed late that night to work on it, and then they charged for the part and the replacement, so it was about $700 to get that diagnosed and figured out. And like I said, it wasn't nothing I could have done at the house. But anyway, we'll see you again.